Tell you when we're all good then. Okay.
Okay. So what was my senior project? I decided that at the beginning of this, I said, I'm a very socially anxious person. I don't necessarily feel comfortable reaching out to people and saying, hey, let's have a conversation. But I really like talking to people. I like talking. So my senior project was I wanted to have conversations with as many people as possible, and I wanted to record those and then sort of listen to them and reflect on my ability as a speaker after the fact. So what does this mean? On a level, I looked at this and I said, it's kind of, I didn't like it because I felt it was a deterministic way of going about things. Like I felt it was judgy of myself, but ultimately, I don't know, I feel like that's development, right? So the initial idea was that I was going to make a podcast type of thing, but over the course of the project, I was like, I don't really like this idea because it feels so corporate and so it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel genuine. So I sort of moved away from that. Although I still ended up recording the podcast, it was much more free form. It was just sort of like, I'm having a conversation with you. We're splitting this up into categories of what we want to talk about. Although I did have questions prepared beforehand. So what did I do before each conversation? I took notes. I took a lot of notes, just sort of realizing who I was talking to, what questions I could ask them that would make an interesting conversation. From there, I did recording. What effect did this have on the conversations that I was having? It was really interesting, right? My first conversation I did with a good friend of mine, and after the fact, we sort of looked at it and we were like, okay, that felt different. Why did it feel different? Is because there was another body in the conversation, that body being the microphone, the phone, recording this. And we thought, it takes away the casualness of a conversation, but it doesn't necessarily make that conversation worse. It just makes it more formal and not exactly representative of what a normal conversation with that person would be, but it still has a lot of context. It still has a lot of meat to it. And then after the fact, after each conversation, I did a final thoughts thing. So that thought about, okay, there's this third body in the conversation. I'd write that down in the final thoughts and I'd just say, okay, here's how I felt about my conversation. Here's how I feel like my skills could be improved in conversing at the end of it. So after that, I said, okay, I need to come up with better questions. After my first conversation, I said, I need to come up with better questions. I need to be more comfortable with that recording device. Okay. So what did I learn from this? I learned that you need to experiment with your conversation abilities. Obviously, I just mentioned how I used my first conversation as kind of a control group to sort of ask myself, okay, where am I as a speaker? What skills do I have? What skills do I need? And then I worked from there. I noticed I had an established language with this person, so therefore it was easier to have that conversation, and I could base myself off of that conversation in future conversations. I used a book of questions. Originally, I wasn't a big fan of this idea. I thought, man, this feels so, it doesn't feel right. It's not that free-form idea that I had. But after a while, I just sort of thought, this is improving the conversation, despite the fact that it's not 100% genuine. It's not off the top of my head. It maintains the quality of it throughout, and it forces people to ask themselves the big questions. My quote here, changing a conversational pattern is not difficult. It does not require extensive training or change in your personality or values. All it takes is a willingness to examine your current conversational patterns, identify the types of conversation and conversational elements you are missing, and practice using them. Why is this important to this slide? Obviously, there's that experimentation element, but it's taking apart the conversations that you're having and saying, this is how they can be improved. And I'll get into why that is important later on. Next slide. Okay. Something else I learned. You need to be engaged. You need to be a good listener. I am not a good listener. I know that. People like to feel understood. And that was something I learned in my research. Is in a conversation, it is quintessential that someone feels like they are being listened to as well. And I try to remember that when I was having my conversations. I wouldn't just someone would be talking about some personal thing, I wouldn't be like, okay, let's talk about movies now. No, I wouldn't do that. I'd keep that in mind. So over the course of the project, I feel like my ability to empathize and listen to others improved because I had that in my head. Another thing I had on my mind was here's the quote for empathy. But if I make the effort to understand them, if they feel understood by me, they listen, learn, and change. That's how we get to a shared truth. Big thing, shared truth. That's ultimately what would come from being empathetic to people. You get those closer bonds because you're actually listening to each other, and that person feels like they're being listened to. Therefore, boom, you're learning about the other person. They're building a relationship. Next slide. Another thing I learned about being engaged in a conversation was being analytical about myself, the conversations I was having, during the conversation with the person I was having the conversation with. So I was stopping to analyze the dynamic that was going on during those conversations. I'd say, this really isn't working. This phone thing really isn't working. This place in which we're having this conversation, whether it be a park or on a bench somewhere, and forcing myself to look into the person's eyes, like, this really isn't working. And addressing that, and therefore, by addressing that, it would fix the problem almost all the time. Just being honest with yourself. My quote here is, if the conversation is going so badly that the content is getting lost, it's critical to talk about what is happening. Obviously, what I just described. Describing what is going on in an empathetic, compassionate, and authentic way can be a powerful means for refocusing. So what I just said, it helps reinforce what's going on in the conversation. It helps make the bond between the speakers stronger. Next slide. Finally, argumentation. I think people are afraid to argue. People are like, man, it's such a conflicting way. Why would I want to be in conflict with someone when I'm having a conversation? But it's very important because it helps people find common ground in what they're saying. It's not always appropriate. We know that, but it's important because of that common ground piece. Because through having an argument, through using your conflicting standpoints on things, you're going to grow closer. My quote here is, argumentation is not just what your instructors do. We all use argumentation on a daily basis, and you probably already have some skills at crafting an argument. So, yeah, you have those skills. It's just using them, not being afraid to use them, and by using them, you're going to improve the conversation that you're having. Okay, next slide. Finally, maintaining self. I wasn't a big fan of the research I had to do. I liked doing the card sheets, don't get me wrong, but I got all this stuff and I was looking at it, it's like, okay, here's how to have the most effective conversation possible. You have to split it up, you have to stratify the way you're having these conversations, you have to get what you want out of the conversation. I just thought, I don't like that. I don't like the idea of getting what I want out of a conversation, because what do I want out of a conversation? I just want to feel like I've learned something. I'm not trying to get something out of someone else, necessarily. So, from there I sort of thought, okay, with this research there's also an element of, you have to be yourself, you have to be the individual. And why is being the individual important? Because the only way that a conversation can feel genuine and a conversation can be worthwhile is if you're being true to yourself, being true to the individual. Therefore, you can put the knowledge that you have, the experiences you have, the insights you have in the conversation. Therefore, that person can take away from those insights. Not to mention that if you're not being true to yourself, the purpose that conversation has in bringing the community together, bringing together society, is it's disingenuous and it's fake, and therefore it's not really bringing anyone together. It's sort of tearing us apart because we're building these not real perceptions of each other, because that's how we're putting on. Learning from others' individuality, that's ultimately what I just said. It's taking the quirks and the ideas of others and saying, okay, I can respect this, I can respect you as an individual, but I'm also going to reflect that onto myself and say, here's what I can learn from being me and you being you. Next slide. What is the importance of conversation? Conversation is an art form, and here we have a quote from the lovely, lovely Joe Rogan. A conversation to me is like going to school. Like going to school about humans. I'm going to school every day. I'm going to school about whatever the subject they're talking to me is about. And that's what I find beautiful about conversation. Conversing with people is I can can cover so much, and I can feel like I've learned so much through having these conversations with people. I can't tell you how many times I've been driving with a friend or something, and I've left and I've said, you know, I learned more in those 2 hours of talking with this person than I learned in the last week of school or something, which is great. And I think it truly is that transferring of ideas from one person to the next, and sort of that volley-esque way of looking at. I'm thinking about it in a tennis way of like throwing ideas back and forth with each other. I mean, it's beautiful. It's an art form. Next slide. Okay, some things I learned about myself through this project. Number one, I learned that it's not as hard to network as I originally thought. People were very, very open in being like, yeah, I'd love to have a conversation with you, which I thought was great. I was really appreciative. But I didn't expect that going in. I thought people would be like very abrasive to the idea, like, what, you want to record me talking? That's very strange. Conversing with a purpose. I feel like a lot of the times it's like, oh, let's talk about, in casual conversations, like, let's talk about shoes, or let's talk about cars, or let's talk about, and it's just kind of like, oh, this is so nothing. And I want to hear about the big ideas when I'm conversing with people, and I think this really helped me to do that in a way that doesn't feel so hackneyed and so forced. Finally, big alleviation of social anxieties. I feel much less self-conscious about myself in a social way, so that's big. Some takeaways for you: I think you should do the same exact thing. I think we need to focus more on the conversations that we're having. You don't necessarily have to record it, but I think you should reach out to people and say, hey, I've never had a conversation with you before, and I'd really like to learn more about you. So yeah, I think that's something you should definitely go out and do, because it could be a huge learning experience for you. And that is all. Thank you.
Do you have any questions for Ben?
Oh, yeah, any questions? Yes, Liam.
What are your favorite topics you discuss with people?
I love the philosophical stuff, but I like, I like the things that I like. I like talking about like movies and stuff, and just getting really into that, getting really into the details of it.
Cool.
Anthony.
Question.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Oh.
Okay. Did you find, you know how in the beginning you said you want to be aware of yourself
Mhm.
and aware of listening to the other person?
Yeah.
Did you find that changed, like, after a while?
I felt more comfortable with my own voice and my own ideas in speaking with people. So yeah, you could say I found
And
that.
how about listening?
Listening, yeah, I think the book of questions really helped, because I could look at people's and be like, okay, this is their answer to this. And I didn't feel like I needed to really lead the conversation, because
Right.
it was kind of an interview-esque thing, but they were saying, okay, here's everything that's on my mind, and I could sort of be like, okay, tell me more.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you have a conversation that you weren't really expecting to like enthrall you that you really did?
I mean, every conversation really did surprise me in a way, because you go into these things expecting one thing, and then you come up with another. I mean, they all surprised me. They all gave me a little bit of something I wasn't expecting, which was great. That's what I wanted. Yep.
Did you ever end up like making and publishing a podcast?
I didn't end up publishing it, but I have them all recorded, and I have them all in there in my SLE portfolio. So yeah.
Is there a way we can find those?
You can go on the SLE portfolio, and you can listen to my podcast. Yeah, my conversation.
All right. Thank you, Ben.